Thomas Hobbes was born on April 5, 1588 in Westport, in the English county of Wiltshire. At the time of his birth, England was under threat from the Spanish Armada, and this chaotic environment is considered one of the first major events that shaped Hobbes's life. His father was an Anglican priest in the small village of Charlton. Towards the end of the year Hobbes was born, his father, Francis Hobbes, had a fight with another priest in the parish and had to leave the church. This event had a significant impact on Hobbes's family structure. His father, Francis Hobbes, was a man whose aggressive behavior greatly affected his life. When his father disappeared after the fight, Hobbes and his siblings had to live separately from their mother. This left Hobbes in the care of his uncle Francis Hobbes. His uncle was a successful merchant and supported Hobbes by giving great importance to his education. During this period, Hobbes had the opportunity to learn to read and write at an early age, and this laid the foundation for his later intellectual life. Thomas Hobbes later began his education at the famous Malmesbury school. This school focused on Latin and Greek literature, which were at the forefront of classical education at the time. Hobbes made rapid progress in these fields and became proficient in Latin and Greek as a child. Supported by his uncle, Hobbes stood out in his school thanks to his talents and interests. At the age of 12, Hobbes was sent to Magdalen Hall, Oxford University, a renowned center of learning. This was another important stage in his intellectual journey. His education at Oxford introduced him to traditional scholastic philosophy and Aristotelian thought. However, Hobbes was dissatisfied with these traditional approaches and would later challenge these systems to develop his own way of thinking. From an early age, Hobbes became interested in mathematics and science. He was particularly interested in Euclid's geometry and deepened in this field. These early interests formed the basis of the mechanical and scientific perspective he would later develop. In addition, Hobbes's childhood upbringing under the influence of war and political chaos left deep traces on the theories of state and society that he would later develop. The instability and uncertainty he experienced during this period deeply influenced Hobbes's later thoughts on social order and authority. Thomas Hobbes's childhood played an important role in shaping his intellectual identity and philosophical thoughts. The importance he attached to his education fueled his lifelong passion for learning. His family's social and economic difficulties laid the foundation for the ideas he developed about the importance of the state and order. These early experiences were one of the driving forces behind Hobbes's views on human nature and society. After his classical education at Magdalen Hall in Oxford, Thomas Hobbes had a series of important experiences and intellectual developments in his youth. This was a period in which he laid the foundations of his intellectual life and planted the first seeds of the philosophical system he would later develop. In 1603, at the age of 15, Hobbes entered Magdalen Hall, now Hertford College, at Oxford University. This was the beginning of his formal academic journey. At the time, Oxford offered a heavy scholastic education centered on Aristotelian philosophy and classical texts. Hobbes was not very happy with the education he received here. In particular, he preferred to move away from the abstract concepts of scholastic thought and develop more concrete and empirical approaches. These years at Oxford were a period in which Hobbes developed his intellectual critical skills and laid the foundation for his future intellectual life. His criticism of Aristotle's metaphysics and scholastic thought led him to more mechanistic and scientific approaches in later years. In 1608, after graduating from Oxford, Hobbes received an appointment that would greatly influence him later in life. Hobbes was hired as tutor to William Cavendish, son of the Duke of Devonshire. This post gave Hobbes the opportunity to establish a close relationship with the English aristocracy and also gave him access to a rich intellectual and social circle. The Cavendish family played an important role in Hobbes's intellectual development. Through his association with this family, Hobbes had the opportunity to meet the leading thinkers and scientists of the time. He also had the opportunity to travel around Europe under the patronage of the Cavendish family. These trips expanded Hobbes's knowledge of the intellectual and cultural life of Europe and encouraged him to think from a broader perspective. On his first trip to Europe in 1610, under the patronage of the Cavendish family, Hobbes was introduced to classical Renaissance culture. His travels in France and Italy enabled Hobbes to bridge the gap between ancient and modern thought. During this period, he met the leading scientists and philosophers of the time and had the opportunity to study their works. During these travels, Hobbes made the transition from classical education to modern scientific thought. Especially the works of Galileo and the ideas of René Descartes had a great influence on Hobbes's intellectual evolution. These experiences led him to adopt and develop a scientific and mechanistic worldview. During his youth, Hobbes increased his intellectual productivity and produced his first important works. In 1628, he translated Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War into English. This translation was indicative of Hobbes's interest in classical texts and began to shape his historical and political thought. Thucydides' work profoundly influenced Hobbes's views on power, war, and human nature. Hobbes drew important lessons about human nature and political order from Thucydides' historical analysis. The work of this period laid the foundation for the political theories he would later develop. Hobbes's youth was a period of growing interest in mathematics and natural philosophy. His interest in the work of Galileo and Descartes helped Hobbes to adopt a scientific and mechanistic worldview. Mathematics and mechanical philosophy became his main tools for understanding human behavior and society. During this period, two main themes were prominent in Hobbes's thought: the laws of nature and social order. He began to think about the foundations of human nature and why people behave in certain ways. These issues would be at the center of his later political philosophy and his famous work, Leviathan. As an adult, Thomas Hobbes became an important figure on the European intellectual scene. During this period, he wrote important works on political philosophy, natural philosophy, and ethics. He also lived through the effects of the English Civil War, which profoundly influenced his thinking about the state and society. Hobbes maintained his connection with the Cavendish family and continued to work in the service of the Duke of Devonshire. This patronage provided Hobbes with financial security and gave him the time and resources to pursue his intellectual projects. This relationship with the Cavendish family lasted throughout his life and allowed Hobbes to interact with the leading political and intellectual figures of the time. Hobbes's adulthood coincided with a period of great political turmoil and civil war in England. In the 1640s, the English Civil War broke out, profoundly affecting Hobbes's life and work. The chaos of war and the collapse of social order caused Hobbes to reflect more deeply on human nature and the role of the state. This period heightened Hobbes's concern for order and stability in society. In 1640, due to political turmoil, Hobbes was forced into exile in Paris. In Paris, he joined French intellectual circles and worked in Mersenne circle. This was a time when he further developed his scientific and mathematical ideas. In particular, his discussions with Descartes and other French scientists deepened his philosophical and scientific thoughts. During his time in Paris, Hobbes wrote his major works On Nature and On the Citizen. These works elaborated his ideas about the laws of nature and social order. While On Nature, De Corpore, demonstrates his mechanistic philosophy and his commitment to the scientific method, On the Citizen, Deceive, laid the foundation for his political philosophy. Hobbes's most famous work, Leviathan, was published in 1651. This work is Hobbes's most comprehensive work on society and the state. In Leviathan, Hobbes analyzed human nature in the natural state and argued that the main motivations that govern people are fear, self-interest, and the desire for power. According to him, life in the natural state would be solitary, poor, loathsome, brutish, and short. Therefore, he argued, people should be subject to a sovereign power by entering into a social contract to ensure security and order. Hobbes's Leviathan offered a radical and different perspective on the nature of the state and authority from the political thought of the time. Although this work is seen as an argument in favor of absolutist monarchy, it actually presents a theory of the social contract that argues that the authority of the state is based on the consent of individuals. This became one of the cornerstones of modern political philosophy. In 1651, Hobbes returned to England and lived a relatively peaceful life in the Commonwealth under Cromwell. However, he also faced some criticism and opposition for his political views. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Hobbes remained under the patronage of Charles II, Hobbes's former pupil. This was an important turning point in Hobbes's life because his ideas were now recognized as an intellectual protected by the monarchy. During this period, Hobbes continued his scientific and philosophical studies and wrote other important works. His Behemoth is an important work in which he analyzes the causes and consequences of the English Civil War. He also continued his studies in mathematics and natural philosophy. When Thomas Hobbes died in 1679 at the age of 91, he left behind a profound intellectual legacy. His ideas about the state, society, and human nature laid the foundations of modern political philosophy. Hobbes's work, especially Leviathan, is still at the center of philosophical and political debate today. Hobbes's adulthood was a period when he reached the peak of his intellectual development and became an important figure in modern philosophy. Hobbes's philosophy includes in-depth reflections on human nature, society, and the state, and is considered one of the cornerstones of modern political philosophy. Thomas Hobbes is one of the founding figures of modern political philosophy. Hobbes's philosophical work focuses on human nature, morality, politics, and the structuring of society. His thoughts are especially known for his work, Leviathan. The main outlines of Hobbes' philosophy are as follows. 1. Human nature and the mechanical worldview. Hobbes' philosophy is based on a mechanistic understanding of human nature and the universe. According to his thought, mechanical philosophy, Hobbes sees the universe and nature as a purely mechanical system. Everything can be explained by motion and the interactions of material parts. This understanding forms the basis of his philosophy, and he tries to understand human behavior in the same way. Human nature. According to Hobbes, human nature is fundamentally selfish and competitive. People innately seek to maximize their own interests, and this leads to conflicts. Hobbes argues that in a governed system, people are primarily driven by three main motivations: competition, insecurity, and the pursuit of glory. 2. The natural state and the laws of nature. One of Hobbes's most important contributions is his introduction of the concepts of the natural state and the laws of nature to understand human society and the state. The natural state. Hobbes uses the concept of the natural state to examine how people behave in the absence of an organized society and authority. In the natural state, people are free and not subject to any authority. However, this freedom leads to chaos and a constant war of all against all. Hobbes describes this state as lonely, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The laws of nature. Hobbes argues that people must follow certain rational rules, laws of nature, to avoid the natural state. The first law of nature requires the use of all means to achieve peace. The second law of nature states that people should delegate their rights to ensure peace and security. These laws require people to be subject to an authority through a social contract. 3. The social contract and the nature of the state. At the center of Hobbes's philosophy is the theory of the social contract, which he uses to explain social order and the authority of the state. The social contract. Hobbes argues that people enter into a contract to avoid the chaos of the natural state by ceding their rights to a sovereign. This contract makes people subject to an authority, Leviathan, and this authority maintains social order and peace. According to Hobbes, people enter into this contract rationally to protect their own interests. The role of sovereign power. Hobbes argues that the sovereign power, i.e. the state, must have absolute authority. This is necessary to ensure peace and order. The power of the sovereign must be unlimited, otherwise society will return to the chaos of the natural state. With this view, Hobbes supports absolute monarchy, but at the same time emphasizes that this authority is based on the consent of individuals. 4. Leviathan. Defining the state. Hobbes's most famous work, Leviathan 1651, is the most comprehensive expression of his political philosophy. Leviathan. Hobbes describes the state as a leviathan, a powerful sea monster from the Old Testament. Leviathan unifies the rights of all individuals in society and uses these rights to maintain social order. By depicting the state in this way, Hobbes emphasizes the importance of a strong and centralized authority. Sovereignty and authority. Leviathan's power is created when individuals in society delegate their authority to protect themselves and keep the peace. This enables the sovereign to ensure that the laws are obeyed and the order of society is maintained. Hobbes argues that the state should use these powers to ensure the security and welfare of individuals. 5. Ethics and moral philosophy. Hobbes also put forward important views on morality and ethics, self-interest and morality. Hobbes argues that people seek to maximize their self-interest, and that this self-interest can be rationally harmonized with moral rules and norms. According to him, moral rules are agreements that people rationally accept to preserve peace and order. Relativism. Hobbes argues that morality is relative and determined by the rules that apply within a particular social order. This leads him to view morality as a human construct, and he is skeptical of the existence of universal moral truths. 6. Philosophy of science and knowledge. Hobbes also made important contributions to the philosophy of knowledge and science, empiricism and rationality. Hobbes argues that knowledge is based on experience and that rational thought is the key to making sense of these experiences. He argues that true knowledge can only be obtained through empirical observations and logical inferences. Mathematics and the mechanical worldview. Hobbes sees mathematics and mechanical philosophy as the basic tools of knowledge. This approach leads him to use scientific and mathematical methods to understand human behavior and society. Thomas Hobbes's philosophy is one of the foundations of modern political philosophy and social thought. His theory of the social contract was later developed by thinkers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and formed the basis of modern democratic theories. Moreover, Hobbes's ideas on human nature and the state are still an important part of political theory, moral philosophy, and legal theory today. Hobbes's work offers a deep insight into understanding the basic features of human nature and how society should be organized. His mechanistic worldview and scientific approaches played an important role in the development of modern philosophy and social sciences.